received her bachelor's from UW-Stevens Point and her master's from UW-Madison. She is currently a research specialist in the soil science department, working in the nutrient cycling and agroecosystems lab. She serves as the research director for the nitrogen optimization pilot program, working with producers across the state to better manage and understand nitrogen use through on-farm research. So thanks for being with us today, Monica. I'll let you take over.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'll apologize off the top. I've got a cold that I just can't quite seem to shake, so my voice is a little unpleasant to listen to, but the content will still be good. Everyone seeing my screen okay?
Looks good.
Okay, perfect. So like Chelsea said, I'm going to be talking about optimizing nitrogen use and reducing nitrate leaching, and I'm going to be focusing kind of on that first part of optimizing nitrate use, and talk about the agronomics of that. And I'll kind of break down my presentation into two parts. First, I'll be discussing the program as itself as a whole, how it's kind of different than anything else that's really been done in the state. And then I'll get into kind of a case study of how we can use this data, even the preliminary data, to assess nitrate leaching and how to address it. So the Nitrogen Optimization Pilot Program, it's funded by DATCAP, and it's a grant program that awards producers up to $50,000 to study their own research question. So they're answering their own question on their own field that's centered around nitrogen. So it's really unique in that way because you get a lot more buy-in from participants, because it's not research that the researchers are carrying out themselves. It's research that's being carried out by the farmer themselves or their agronomists or any other partners they might have. So that's kind of the unique thing about this program. So in the first cycle, grants were awarded last year around February or March, and we had 20 funded projects with 50 producers across the state. And this is in 18 counties, and we had $1.58 million awarded in this first cycle of the program. So, like I said, the project's unique because producers could really answer their own questions. So we had a lot of different unique projects. A lot of them were kind of generally corn nitrogen rate trials, testing out different things. Kind of everyone kind of put their own twist on it, on different soil types or under different management strategies. And then we had a lot of these projects that had an aspect of corn nitrogen rate trial with. So these projects had another component. So they're answering kind of two questions with these trials. So some looking at biological products, some looking at cover crops, you know, if nitrogen management needs to be adjusted following a cover crop. Some kind of unique ones looking at grazing or manure application or some different technology or soil types. And then we have our specialty projects, or like we call our non-corn projects. And these looked at, we had some looking at cranberries, forages, and then potatoes. And that's the project that I'm going to be focusing on today and presenting the data from today. So first, I'm just going to kind of break down what a standard nitrogen rate trial looks like and what kind of the basic requirements are for this program before we get into the kind of complex potato project. So standard nitrogen rate trial, it can include as many rates as you want. In the program, we had kind of a range from 4 to 8 nitrogen rates. Here in this example, we have 5. And it's really just a strip of a nitrogen rate across the field. And we required a 0 in this program. And that 0 nitrogen rate is really important because it helps you assess the actual value of the fertilizer that you're putting on the field. Say at that lowest rate of 75, you get a corn yield of 150 bushels per acre. Pretty, you know, it's an okay yield for a low fertilizer amount. But how much of that is actually coming from the fertilizer and how much of that is coming from the soil itself through mineralization of nitrogen or any residual nitrogen that was in the soil? So by having that 0, we know how much came from the soil itself. We have kind of that control. So you're able to make those comparisons and assess the true value of the fertilizer. And then the nitrogen rates, we kind of want something above and below of what that producer is usually doing so that we're able to kind of get a representative value for around what the producer is already doing. And then another kind of unique thing about this program, which I think caused a lot of people to say, no way, I'm not doing this, is that we required 4 replicates. So the replicates are kind of a pain because you have to, it increases the size of the project quite a bit, but it's really, really important from the data side, because if we see one effect kind of in this corner of the field happening, what's to say that that's the true effect and not just due to kind of the placement of the location of the strips? So by replicating the trial kind of across the field 4 times, then we're able to take averages and standard deviation. And if we're seeing the same effect happen 4 times, you know, we have more confidence that that effect is true. So that's kind of the other requirement of this program. We need a 0, multiple nitrogen rates, and then replication, so that we're able to get data that's sound and that we can really trust when we put it into different data sets, and it can live on beyond this program. So this is kind of what the results look like from that standard yield response type project. So on our x-axis, we have nitrogen rate in pounds per acre, and then our y-axis, we have corn yield. So you can see as nitrogen rate increases, corn yield increases for the most part, but eventually it plateaus, it flattens out. This is an example of a trial, but if they don't all look like this, believe me, if they did, my job would be a heck of a lot easier. But this point where it plateaus, we call the agronomic optimum nitrogen rate. So in this example, it's 151 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So at that point, there was no yield benefit in adding any more nitrogen. And the yield there was 190 bushels per acre. Then we also have something called the economic optimum nitrogen rate. So we're able to calculate this by a corn to price ratio. We use a corn to price ratio of 0.1, but that's obviously going to vary from year to year, even from day to day. That's going to vary a little bit, but we use kind of the standard 0.1. And that's kind of telling us at what point is applying fertilizer not worth it anymore. You're not getting the value and yield as you're getting the nitrogen that's being put out. So you're not getting any more bang for your buck. You're not making any more money by putting out any more nitrogen. So in this example, it's 120 pounds per acre. So that's a 30-pound per acre difference between the economic and the agronomic. And the yield's 189 bushels per acre. So only 1 bushel per acre yield difference for 30 pounds of nitrogen. You don't need a degree in agronomy to know that that's probably not going to be worth it. But where this kind of ties to water quality, we see this plateau. We see all these nitrogen rates after this point, even agronomically, and especially economically. It's not worth it to add any more nitrogen. But that nitrogen's going somewhere. Even though you're not getting that return of value in grain, that's going somewhere. And that's where you can see kind of the negative effects to water quality. So through this program, if we can get yield curves and get a better idea of how to manage nitrogen in crops and avoid fertilizing in this range where it's plateauing, we can see real changes in water quality and some real benefits there. So we want to kind of scale back on this curve and be fertilizing at these optimum nitrogen rates. So now I showed you kind of the simplest approach with the perfect data, which sometimes it looks like that, which is great. But what I found from this study, there's truly no one-size-fits-all approach. We have 20 different projects on 50 different farm fields. We have kind of different farmers involved in certain projects. So we have more than 20 different plot plans for these different programs. And we really want to do that because we wanted to be inclusive to different cropping systems, different cropping types. Maybe people who haven't done on-farm research before because they couldn't fit that perfect square in their field. We really wanted to be inclusive and include these things and kind of find ways around making these replicated projects work in different management scenarios. So now I'm going to get into what is one of the more complex management scenarios, the potato. So Wisconsin ranks 3rd in the country for potato production. And a lot of that production happens in the central part of the state, this light blue soils of the central sandy plains, the central sands of Wisconsin. And it's great because these soils are very good for vegetable production. But the challenge is that these sandy soils don't hold water very well. They don't hold nitrogen very well. So those nutrients in that water is prone to leaving the system. So it's really important that we manage nitrogen correctly in these areas. But the problem is, if we want to manage nitrogen correctly, we need to study it. We need to understand how much nitrogen these crops need and where there's opportunity to potentially scale back. But the problem is, this is just a Google Maps screen capture of some agriculture in the central sands. As you can see, the area is very heavily dominated in agriculture and a lot of circular fields. So this area is commonly irrigated. So you're providing water for those crops throughout the growing season in order to get profitable crops. But that also provides a challenge when you're trying to fit on-farm research onto these circular irrigated fields. And another challenge on top of that, I know I'm just providing challenge after challenge after challenge, but another challenge is that the fertilizer regimen is a little different and a little less straightforward than it is for a lot of other crops. So in potato production, a lot of times nitrogen is put out at planting, at hilling when that soil is kind of built up around that potato for optimum growth and tuber formation, and then also at fertigation. So that can kind of happen at a series of time points across the season, but fertigation is when the field is irrigated and some fertilizer is included in that irrigation water and is spread across the field. So that kind of adds another challenge, because as you can see, this irrigation line is long, it's kind of all doing the same thing. So it's kind of hard to get those variable rates out. But the good news is, despite all these challenges, we had some very, very motivated and hardworking and experienced agronomists and producers that were able to make some of these trials happen on farm at a large scale. So we had 2 farms involved in this NOPP project, and we'll first focus on this farm A. And I know I'm gonna present the study design, but it's really important to understanding the data to understand this design. So not only did it's enough of a challenge just to do a nitrogen rate trial, but they wanted to look at 2 variables. So the first variable they wanted to look at was fertigation timing. So like I said, fertigation is when that fertilizer is included in the irrigation water to kind of provide nitrogen to that crop throughout the season. So we had an early fertigation period, a late fertigation period, and then a period that received both of those fertigation times, so both. And then we had our 0N. They found a way to make it work even with the irrigation and the fertigation. They found a way to kind of stop the irrigation here and not do fertigation in this wedge. So they kind of wedged up the field for this. And then they did 3 nitrogen rates. This is kind of the second variable added. And they did this in rows across the field. The nitrogen rates were 240, 270, and 300 pounds of N per acre. So now, like I said, one of the requirements of the program was to have replicates across the field, so we could have more than one data point. So they did this, we have these like pseudo replicates. So they harvested a 15-foot stretch within each of these treatments, and we can call each of those a rep. So then we'll look at the timing. So how much nitrogen went out when in each of these treatments. So at planting, everything got 30 pounds of nitrogen. Then at the first hilling, that's when they were able to put out those variable rates of nitrogen, because it'd be impossible to do that with the fertigation. So they did it at that first hilling time point. So in the early and late fertigation, they put out over half of the nitrogen at that first hilling. And then because they weren't receiving as much later on in the season. And then both fertigation, they're receiving more nitrogen in season. So at that first hilling, they put out about 1/3 of that nitrogen. But again, the 240, the 270, and the 300, those are the total numbers of the total amount of nitrogen that's put out throughout the growing season. So then at fertigation, the early and late received that 75 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and the both received double that because it was getting it at those 2 time points. So again, lots going on here, but just know that we've got the 3 different fertigation timings and the 3 N rates of the total that was going out. So now for project design farm B, similar thing, field's just a little different shape. It was a little easier for them to actually do it on this field. So again, 3 fertigation timings, that 0N control, a little wedge in there, 3 nitrogen rates, 4 reps within each of those strips, 30 pounds of nitrogen at planting. First hilling is when they put out the variable rate, and the rating is a little different just because on these farms they put out a little different amount in the fertigation. So we have a little more nitrogen put out in the first at hilling and this farm. And then fertigation, we had a little more nitrogen put out there, but nothing too significant, about the same. So about 77 pounds put out in the early and late, and then double that in the both. So again, total nitrogen 240, 270, 300. All right, so now let's get we know the project design, we kind of know the questions they're wondering, but what is the usable yield here? So tubers are interesting because, and potatoes specifically, because a lot of these are going to a processing company where they're becoming French fries. So not only is it important to have a lot of yield, but the quality of that yield is also really important. So we're going to focus on the usable yield, and that takes out anything that's misshapen. This isn't going to turn into a French fry very well, so that's not going to be used and not considered usable yield, not profitable for the company or the farmer. And then we have anything with rot can't be used, and anything that's green can't be used. We don't want green French fries. Unless McDonald's is running a St. Patty's Day promotion, then maybe we would. But for Farm A, so now we'll focus on that usable yield. So first we'll look at the none. So this is the potato yield in hundredweight with no fertilizer put out. So this is that 0 wedge. See, pretty decent yield, higher than 450 hundredweight. But pretty variable data. And this is pretty common in potato research, which is another challenge and kind of highlights the need for more research in this area. Pretty variable, but that's our yield at 0. And these graphs are a little different than something you've normally seen maybe. The data points are highlighted in these dots, and then the line across is the average, just to kind of highlight the variation in the data so you can get a look at the whole, a view of the whole of the data set as a whole. So then in our early, we see as nitrogen rate increases, yield increases just at that higher nitrogen rate, but still not all that much. Again, if you look at the variation. And then we see this kind of interesting effect in the late fertigation timing. So again, these potatoes were maybe lacking some nitrogen earlier in the season, and then when that nitrogen was put out, we actually saw the more nitrogen that was put out, we saw a decrease in yield. And this can happen, our kind of hypothesis here is that when that nitrogen was put out, the potato allocated it more towards vegetative growth rather than tuber growth. So we saw that yield decline as nitrogen rate increased. And then in our early and late fertigation period, this is kind of closest to the grower standard. What would normally happen, business as usual, would kind of be that middle rate. And you can see that's kind of the highest yield, and it's beneficial to have it kind of more spoon-fed throughout the season. And you can see it kind of goes up at that middle and then goes down. But kind of something interesting just to highlight here. I think in a lot of years, we wouldn't see this effect where early was actually out-yielded early and late. Because a lot of times in the early fertigation, a lot of that nitrogen's in the soil, and if there's a heavy rain, that can be washed out pretty quickly, and that potato can be lacking nitrogen later in the season. So I think this is kind of an interesting effect that is probably likely due to the drought. So then Farm B, when we look at usable yield, again, nitrogen rate on our x-axis, potato yield in hundredweight on the y-axis. A little less variation in the 0 in this farm, just below 400. And then again with early, as the nitrogen rate increases, yield increases. The late, we see a different effect than we saw in Farm A, nitrogen rate increases, yield increases. And then again, early to late, we kind of see a little, those averages are a little closer. And we don't see as much of an effect, but at that higher nitrogen rate, we do have a little yield increase. And the interesting thing with potato that I think makes it different than a lot of our other commodity crops is that it's it's a high value crop. So even a small increase in, even a small increase in yield from a nitrogen, jump of 30 pounds per acre can be profitable. So that's kind of another challenge in the potato production system, is that these smaller yield increases can still be profitable. So calculating that economic optimum nitrogen rate is a little more difficult. So then just some other quality parameters that are interesting in the potato world. Tuber weight, kind of the goal with what these potatoes are being used for. The goal is kind of to land between 3 and 10, which we can see they landed within that at all nitrogen rates, but a little lower size at that lowest nitrogen rate. And then specific gravity, this is another, it's kind of like it's the measure of the solids or starch of the potato relative to the amount of water in the potato. And anything below this red line is kind of more difficult to process. So we do see that, based on the data points, we see more data points at that lowest nitrogen rate falling below that threshold. But at the nitrogen rates, 240, 270, 300, we don't really see a real difference there. So that's just kind of highlighting the agronomics of this one project. And Guolong's going to kind of get more into the water quality aspects of it. But this is just one project out of all these projects that are included in the nitrogen optimization pilot program. So we're really able to gather a lot of data from these projects. And once we have a couple of years of this under our belt, and we've got more cycles going, we're going to be able to kind of group things together and create some larger data sets out of these projects. And it's all thanks to, we've really had a great round of grant awardees in the first cycle, and they've really done a great job executing these projects. And I'm really looking forward to working in the future on the next cycle. So if you're interested, if you want to find out more about the other projects that are included in this program, you can scan this QR code. It'll bring you to the extension Facebook page where we post weekly, or I think it's bi-weekly project updates for the program. And then we have the contact info of my Lindsay Rushford, kind of my counterpart on this, who does some of the outreach. I'm kind of the data side of things. And then Susan Mockert is the program coordinator at DATCAP, so she's taking care of everything on that side. And we do have another application cycle. So I'm sure after this complex project designs I showed you, you're just raring to get one on your field. So we do have a second cycle of the program. The UW review was due December 15th. That was just kind of getting a project design or idea to us by then. You can still apply for the grant program, but those who had it in by the 15th will have priority, but I would still suggest applying. And I think we're gonna have future cycles, so it'd be good to at least get something sketched out this year, even if it doesn't end up getting submitted. So you can contact myself or Lindsay for that. But final applications are due January 31st, and awards will be announced February, March of this year. And there's a QR code there that'll bring you to the DATCAP webpage where you can find out more information. And that's all I've got. Leave this up for a second. And I'll also drop this link in the chat.
Thanks, Monica. That was a great presentation. I always appreciate the hand-drawn maps too. Shows the dedication. Great. Well, while we transition, we have a little bit of work for you guys as the audience to do. We're going to launch a quick poll to collect a bit of information from you. This anonymous demographic information will help us evaluate the audiences that we're reaching with this type of work, and is required for some of our funding sources. So as a heads up, there'll also be one more question at the end of the webinar that will assess how much you learned from your time today. So we take this super seriously, and we use it so we can keep improving these webinars and our programming and make the most of your time. So please take a moment to fill this out. We appreciate it. And Monica, there was a question in the chat, in the Q&A, about that first nitrogen response curve, which I believe was an example, but if you wanted to clarify, that would be good. It's in the answered part of the Q&A now.
Oh, yeah, okay, sorry, I found it.
Nope, you're good.
Yeah, so this is just an example. This specific study just looked at nitrogen rate. So that was really the only variable that was different, but it was a study that did surface or broadcast applied urea at like side dress times, like V3, V4. But I'm happy to go into more detail about that study specifically if you want to shoot me an email or something.
Oh, all right, it was real data. My mistake. So thank you, Monica.
Yeah, it was real data. Yep.
And she'll stick around, so keep putting questions in there for her if you have them. So our next speaker is Guolong Liang. He is an outreach specialist with the Ag Water Quality Program and Extension. He focuses on water quality related to commercial vegetable agriculture in central Wisconsin. So he is based in UW Stevens Point, and he's also a really good chef if you ever have the chance to have him cook for you. So I'll take it away. We can see your slides. Everything looks good.
I did not unmute myself. Well, thank you, Chelsea, and good afternoon, everyone. Monica did a great job to help us understand the significance of why we should conduct these nitrogen rate trials and finding the optimized rate to apply to our farms. But one of the most important goals of such effort is to improve our efficiency in using nitrogen, right? So that we can minimize the impacts on water quality. We'll spend the next 20 minutes or so learning more about nitrogen and some strategies to reduce the impacts on water. But to start us off, we talk about nitrogen leaching all the time, but what exactly is nitrate leaching? Nitrate itself is a form of nitrogen carrying a negative charge. Nitrate is important for plant growth because it can be more readily taken up by plants compared to other nitrogen sources. It also turned out to be tricky to be managed because it can also leach through the soil into the groundwater. And this process is called nitrate leaching. Nitrate leaching can cause different degrees of nitrate contamination in our shared water systems. In babies, nitrate contamination can cause blue baby syndrome. This is a condition that affects how blood carries oxygen, leading to weakness, excess heart rate, fatigue, and dizziness. In all people, nitrate may increase the rate of thyroid diseases and colon cancer. In ecosystems, high nitrate concentration in freshwater and ocean fuels eutrophication from local algae blooms in lakes and ponds, all the way to the dead zones in Gulf of Mexico. So the consequences of nitrate contamination is severe, but how can we as land stewards help protect our water together? The first step is that we need to understand the timing of when nitrate leaching occurs. In general, nitrate leaching occurs most often under three circumstances. Soils with high drainage capacity, high soil nitrate concentration, and heavy rainfalls that cause significant drainage. In Wisconsin, this causes differences in when and where it occurs in the state. But let's continue to use sandy soil as an example with coarse textured soils and easily drained. In a model proposed by a group of researchers here in Wisconsin, in a vegetable cropping systems on sandy soils, the potential for leaching is high when ground is less covered and there is high amount of rainfall. Showing this graph, two periods appear to be extra vulnerable for nitrate leaching to occur. First is when the ground is less covered in the spring before the crop develops full canopy, together with heavy spring precipitation from both snowmelt as well as rainfall. The second period is when potato nitrogen uptake decreases at the end of the growing season, when the amount of rainfall also peaks in the season. This model is supported by a field lysimeter trial conducted in Wisconsin Central Sands. A lysimeter is a device that is buried in the soil with the intention to capture natural soil water movement. This graph shows us the total amount of nitrate nitrogen leaching over multiple growing seasons of a typical crop rotation in the Central Sands. Like we saw in the graph, in the growing year of sweet corn, you can see that the most amount of nitrate leaching happened in two periods. First, right after harvest, from August to October, and second in the spring when the soil starts to thaw. These big jumps in the curves indicates a huge amount of nitrogen loss during these two time periods. In this trial, we actually saw close to 60% of the annual nitrate leaching losses occur during the shoulder season, which are the months between harvesting of the current crop and planting of the next crop. Note that when we think about corn systems instead, the corn is usually harvested later when compared to a vegetable rotation, meaning that sometimes corn won't come off until November or sometimes even December. From a similar lysimeter trial conducted in Arlington Research Station, you can see from the results that 73% of total leaching loss occurred during the spring from April to June. The nitrogen source is likely from soil residue nitrogen from the previous year's nitrogen management or mineralization of organic sources. This also happens to be the period where you have heavy rainfall and snow melt, leading to high drainage. But notice that this will vary from year to year, depending on the climate conditions. So that's why the amount and the timing of nitrate leaching of each specific growing season will vary from field to field. From both the corn and vegetable systems, however, we can see that the shoulder seasons are the vulnerable periods where the nitrogen can leave the field. As a result, one of the major challenges for us is to think of ways to minimize nitrate leaching during the shoulder seasons. Now we have gained a basic understanding of nitrate leaching. What next? Since we can't manage when or how much it rains or snows, we should focus on three things in terms of management. First, let's become aware of how much nitrogen is under risk to be leached in our farm fields. Today, we're going to use a few examples to show you how to estimate that on the field-by-field scale, continuing the conversation using the NOPP dataset. Secondly, let's go back to the fundamentals of FAR, especially checking and accounting for all nitrogen sources and applying the right rate of nitrogen. Thirdly, let's keep the ground covered during the growing season. We will briefly discuss the impacts of the benefits of cover crops on water quality. To start, how can we estimate the potential of nitrate leaching, and what does that even mean, right? For those who were here last year for our webinar series, you would remember that I introduced a tool called Nitrate Leaching Calculator. The interface shown here, this is a screenshot of the web-based tool. For those who weren't with us last year, it is essentially a tool that looks at the nitrogen cycle as a budget. It takes into account the field conditions such as soil drainage class and organic matter content, environmental data such as rainfall and nitrogen input amount and yield to calculate the amount of nitrogen at risk for leaching at the end of a growing year. This number specifically is also termed as leachable nitrogen, as I'll refer to a little bit more in the rest of this presentation. As you can see, leachable nitrogen in this system is calculated through taking nitrogen input, such as fertilizer, and subtracting it by the nitrogen output, the amount of nitrogen removed from the field, like those in the harvest material, and fluctuations in the soil storage, in terms of taking the post-harvest nitrogen concentration and dividing and subtracting that by the pre-planting ones. If you're interested to learn more about the mechanics of the tool itself, please go to our Topic Hub website to watch our last year's webinar, where we went into details about each of these components within the calculator. Today, we're going to use the data from the NOPP trial that Monica just presented on to dig deeper on what we can learn from not only the agronomics, but also the water quality outcomes. We're going to start with an example to show you what a nitrogen budget actually looks like. So this example is looking at a 50-acre irrigated potato field with excessively well-drained soil with low organic matter content, a typical field in the Wisconsin Central Sands. In this field, 300 pounds of nitrogen worth of urea ammonium nitrate was applied, and the average yield was 525 bags of potatoes. And in this trial, because of irrigation, 14 inches of 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate nitrogen was accounted for from the irrigation water. This table shows the general nitrogen balance that we just talked about. We have all the inputs of nitrogen accounted in the blue tab, the amount of nitrogen output in the orange tab, the changes of soil nitrogen storage in the brown tab, and leachable nitrogen numbers, which is the calculated one from this equation, in the green tab. We can see that the leachable nitrogen after calculation in this example is 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. What does that mean, right? So this basically means that during the period of this growing year, from planting of the potato crop to planting of the next crop in the following year, on this field, 100 pounds per acre worth of nitrogen was at risk for leaching. But what does that number actually mean for this 50-acre field? Well, for a 50-acre field, we can see that the total amount of leachable nitrogen for the field is 100 units times 50 acres, which is 5,000 pounds of nitrogen per field. If a farm, say, has 10 fields with similar sizes, conditions, and management, on this farm, we can estimate the total leachable nitrogen per year amounts to 50,000 pounds of nitrogen. If we convert that to the amount of fertilizer, such as UAN 32, we're talking $32,000 per year worth of nitrogen at risk to be leached. Now, if the management continues to be the same over the next 10 years, we're essentially at risk of losing more than 300 grand worth of nitrogen fertilizer for the upcoming decade. Granted, each field is different, so that's why we would recommend you to run this for all your fields on your farm to do a holistic risk evaluation in terms of nitrate leaching. But as you can see, a lot is on the line for us to manage nitrogen more efficiently. And one of the ways to increase our efficiency is through conducting on-farm trials like NOPP to learn from not only the results, but also the process itself. Now, with the data in the NOPP trials, we calculated the leachable nitrogen under each nitrogen rate treatment. And this is what we found. This graph shows the yield on the left y-axis versus the leachable nitrogen of potatoes under different nitrogen rate on the right y-axis. Looking at this graph, we have nitrogen rate and we have the nitrogen rate on the horizontal axis, and you can see that as nitrogen rate increased from 0 to 240, yield increased from 463 bags to 547 bags. When 30 more pounds of nitrogen was applied, yield did not increase, but decreased 2,400 weight. And the effect of this is shown in the red line, where the leachable nitrogen jumped from 55 units of nitrogen to 92 units of nitrogen. This shows us as we are approaching the agronomic optimum rate that Monica talked about, the more nitrogen we apply, the more risk we're under to lose nitrogen on those fields. And this is again observed in the 300 nitrogen rate treatments, where you applied more nitrogen, but you don't see the benefits in terms of return on yield, while the leachable nitrogen increased almost exponentially. In Farm B, we saw very similar results, and the conclusions from Farm A are still consistent. More nitrogen is at risk for leaching when rate increases, but yield plateaus. As you can see, leachable nitrogen varies depending on management, soil type, and crop yield, as we talked about, and see these variable numbers. As a result, we would recommend you to really use the field by field scale when you're applying this approach. If you'd like to start using the calculator, feel free to email me and I can get you started on how to use the calculator and guide you through the process. After estimating the nitrate leaching potential of each of our fields, it is worth mentioning the importance of the fundamentals, right? Let's be mindful of all of the forms of nitrogen we are applying to our ag fields. Well, depending on the systems that you're in, it is easy to miss some of the sources of nitrogen when you're applying and planning the nutrients for the next growing season here in 2024. Here, I would like to highlight two specific resources on irrigation nitrogen and how to take NPK credits from different sources. You can find the article on the left titled "How Much Nitrogen is in Your Irrigation Water" from our topic hub again. The link hopefully should be being pasted in the chat boxes right now. And I will also direct you to the tools developed by our colleagues over at Nutrient and Pest Management team, where they developed an app to help you calculate NPK credits for manure as well as legumes. Last but not least, let's talk about cover crops, right? Everybody has been talking about cover crops these days, but what are we talking about when we put that into the context of water quality? Although most cover crops provide benefits of reducing soil erosion, increasing soil health, not all cover crops are equally effective when they're in terms of reducing the nitrate leaching risks. And what do I mean by that? One of the important things when it comes to reducing nitrate leaching risks for cover crops is that it is essentially adding a component to the nutrient cycles. And the nutrient cycling goals of growing cover crops is to minimize the amount of mobile nitrogen during those shoulder seasons, so that the amount of leaching sources is limited. And to achieve such goals, cover crops can either, one, overwinter, and two, gain significant biomass. And those cover crops that achieve these two goals show the most promising water quality benefits. Here I'm sharing two tables from a publication from our colleagues at UW explaining the specific dynamic between cover crops, manure, and nutrient management. And from this table, we can get information such as winter hardiness, as well as the recommended planting dates for the cover crops for the better chances of success. You can see that with overwintering plants such as winter rye and winter wheat, you have the opportunity to plant it a little bit later than the winter kilt species. And being able to overwinter provide these cover crops more opportunity to take up more nitrogen in the spring, so that less can be leached or washed out of the field. However, not all cover crops are equally effective. Again, at the same time, it really depends on the performance of the cover crop. What is the total above ground biomass that you are harvesting, that you have generated on your fields? In this table, examples including annual ryegrass, spring barley, as well as winter rye are given with the total biomass, or total above ground biomass, and the changes in plant available nitrogen, which is also here noted as PAN. And the research found that there was 40 pounds less plant available nitrogen in the soil when a winter rye cover crop was used compared the plots without a cover crop. In this case, what does that mean? That translates essentially to 40 units of nitrogen captured by the winter rye during the growing season, during the shoulder season, excuse me, so that those 40 pounds are no longer available for nitrate leaching. However, in order to see such benefits, right, it does require you to have a decent amount of biomass for those cover crops. In this case, more than 2,000 pounds per acre worth of winter rye is needed to see such benefits on the water quality. So all in all, what are some steps that we can take to reduce nitrate leaching from our farm fields? Well, first, you can't manage what you can't measure, right? In this case, use the nitrate leaching calculator as a hindcasting risk evaluation tool to gain awareness of the nitrate leaching potential of your fields, so that we can start to identify some opportunities to reduce that leaching potential, also the risk for nitrate leaching. Second, make sure that we account for all nitrogen sources in managing our nitrogen. It is important input on our farm, so we want to know, make sure that we know where it's from, where it's being applied, and how much we are applying. Third, we should continue the conversation of using cover crops and its benefits to water quality with a critical mind in different soil types. There are multiple factors that affect the success of a cover crop, however you define such success, which brings me to a point where I would recommend you to think about what your conservation goals actually are in using cover crops, and then prioritize your planting and specific management of your cover crops based on those conservation goals. Lastly, let's think about evaluating our progress continuously. This is usually the point that most people miss because it takes time and effort to see the difference. We're not going to see our water become clean overnight, right? The word conservation is less of a one-off deal, but a continuous process. And they include trial and error, community support, and constant reevaluation. Having routine evaluations such as using a calculator on your fields on an annual basis or evaluating cover crops biomass and trying different cover crops mixes on different fields will truly help you build your knowledge as well as a database. And only through that way can we best reach our conservation goals on our individual farms. Thank you.
Thank you, Guolong, for the great presentation. A few quick notes before we go to questions. I saw a few hands raised, so I realized maybe the chat wasn't working. So now at least you should be able to chat panelists and hosts. So feel free to enter there or again in the Q&A. All right, so as a moderator, I'm gonna take the first question and I'm gonna have it be for Monica because she got a little break from talking. So I'm wondering, Monica, if you can just share some insights on what was kind of shocking or the most like the lessons learned from producers or crop consultants who participated in the program this year.
Yeah, I think first I'll just think of the most recent thing. We've got a lot of yield response curves that either are flat or that didn't plateau at all. So I think that was kind of just because we're used to seeing yield response curves with that nice plateau like that example I showed. So those are things you wouldn't know, you know, if you have the same yield with no nitrogen as you do with 200 pounds of nitrogen, like that's something you would never guess and you wouldn't know unless you did a nitrogen rate trial like this. So I think that's one thing. And secondly, I would say the amount of time that it takes for the sampling. When you have all of these treatments and replicates, pretty soon things can start to stack up, and just taking some quick nitrate samples in your plots can turn into a full day's project with a lot of hands. So I think that's another thing that we found. But in the second year of the program, we're going to have some field techs to kind of help out on those bigger sampling days on the projects to send out and help out and hopefully alleviate some of that. But I would say those are two big takeaways from this year.
Great. And then just follow-up question, have you seen like grant applications like adapt or change from year 1 to year 2?
I would say the second year we have more new producers. So I think in the first year of this grant program, a lot of the awardees were folks who had done on-farm research before and maybe were experienced with working with UW. And in this next cycle, we've got some more people who haven't done on-farm research, but are still submitting really good projects and putting good projects together. So I think it'll be good to have some new relationships with UW and folks who can get more comfortable doing on-farm research and then expand beyond the program, hopefully too. So.
Great, thank you. And then there's a few in the chat. Michael had a question about how soil variability would impact the nitrogen optimization. So if either of you wanted to talk about, maybe how you change study design or how soil texture, impacts potential yield or potential nitrate leaching.
Yeah. Well, I can talk about how different soil types affect the potential leachable nitrogen or the nitrate leaching process in general. But before I do that, let me post up the CU QR code. So very good question, right? It really varies, different soil types. And at the beginning, Zoom just quit it unexpected. Can you hear me all right, Chelsea?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. As I was talking about, it really varies depending on different soil types.
I lost him. Oh.
All right, we lost Guolong. We'll wait for.
Now he's back.
I know Zoom is gonna fool us on me. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yes, never simple. Go for it.
Okay, cool. Oh, again, let me pull up the C credits thing as I answer the question. In the beginning of my presentation, I showed two different lysimeter trials. One is done on silt loam soil and one is done on loamy sand. So it really shows the difference between like how nitrogen movement is different depending on the drainage capacity of these two soil types. In sands, because you have much higher drainage capacity, the nitrogen moves faster and is more responsive in terms of how you see it shows up on the lysimeter collected data. In the more heavier soil, that's less obvious. However, over a period of, say, a whole crop rotation, if you do a total nitrogen budget on the throughout 4 to 5 years, then the number that lines up pretty well when you estimate the leaching potential together with the lysimeter data. So yeah, and I'll be curious to hear Monica say anything about like designing agronomic trials and how that's different on different soil types.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I think it brings up a really good challenge. You know, there's variation in the field, and that's why it's so important to have those replicates, because even with some in-field variation, you can kind of link it back to, okay, was generally this one replicate yielding a lot higher than the others? And then the way that you can build these statistical models to parse out the differences is you include the rep in the model, so it kind of takes out that variable, and you can determine what differences are due to nitrogen rate alone and what differences are just due to field position. But I think ideally it'd be best to kind of have a more uniform field, and we even had some producers kind of do like side-by-side trials in one field that had a finer soil texture and one field that had a coarser soil texture, and make those comparisons. And there's pretty significant yield differences and the amount of nitrogen that was needed to reach those yields. So it's an interesting, it really gets into how variable this is and how variable nitrogen management is, and how there's so much more to explore, especially in terms of soil types.
Great. Thank you, Monica. All right. So, Guolong, do you see this one about tile drainage versus nitrate leaching? Do you feel there's a question on, using a lysimeter versus just monitoring tile outlets? And I think Kelsey's going to post one of her recent articles, but I was curious if you had anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? I think I'll let Kelsey take that because Kelsey has written a great article summarizing some of the tau data in terms of nitrates from the Discovery Farms data set. So hopefully we can post that in the chat a little bit later, Mark. So, but if you're interested to learn more about how to monitor that, and feel free to talk to either the Discovery Farms research manager, Lindsay Harfield, or any of the outreach specialists that's in the room today, and we'll explain it further to you.
Great, thanks. And then I see that Dean has a question about soil infiltration. So Dean is in southern Wisconsin, so keep that in mind, Guolong. So typically, with soil health, we think of the benefits of increasing water infiltration and how that can help us in the wet springs. What's the relationship there for potential nitrate leaching with increased infiltration?
Oh, that's a really good question. That's a question I ponder all the time. So like you said, right, like soil with good irrigation increase the infiltration capacity. Water moves faster, more water can go through the soil profile when you're on those heavier soils. And when you think about how much nitrogen is actually leached through the profile, it's two things, like the concentration of nitrogen as well as the drainage amount. So are we talking about 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate going through the profile and say 4 to 5 inches over the spring? So that it really depends on the combination of those two factors. In the case where we have higher amount of drainage, but if you have cover crops on the field, hopefully the nitrate concentration in those drainage water is lower, so that the overall nitrogen load that is potentially leaching to the groundwater, overall the overall nitrogen load is lower. But it really depends on the field situation, and but yeah, that's a really good question that I think we need more research on.
Yeah, great point there about the concentration, right? So if you had a grass cover crop in the field, more of that nitrate would be in the above ground biomass in an organic nitrogen form, and then less available to leaching in the soil profile. So and then one last question from Brian before we finish up about legume cover crops and nitrogen leaching, which is one of my favorite topics. So I'll just add one quick comment, but yeah, there's been some meta-analysis that the legumes are worse at helping with nitrate leaching than grass cover crops, and that could be because they're they can fix nitrogen, so they can add more to the system, or because of their lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, that could be mineralizing faster in the spring than that high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So Brian, I can look to send you that article. Anything to add, Monica or Guolong?
No, I would just to add that when you even though you might be adding more nitrogen to the system, you still have those other benefits of cover crops kind of outweighing it. That if you're doing cover crops year after year after year, you're building soil organic matter, and that those nutrients are just more likely to stick around in general.
Great point. All right, we are at 1 p.m. So for the sake of time, thank you for attending, everyone. Hopefully you got the QR code. So thanks for spending
Chelsea, can we run the knowledge pool question?
Yep. Go ahead and launch that. So great. So thanks for attending today, everyone. We will be posting the videos on YouTube after, so you'll be able to share them, or if someone missed them today, let them know about that. Our next webinar will be in 2 weeks, January 30th at the same time. And it will be Laura Paletta and Maureen Muldoon, both from UW-Madison, presenting a webinar with the topic Wisconsin's unique karst landscape and the impacts on water quality. So we hope to see you there, and have a great rest of your day.